Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the day soften around you, and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Land Beside the Inland Sea. At low tide, the mouth of the Puyallup River opens into a wide and quiet meeting place. Fresh water moves toward the bay, passing reeds and grasses rooted in the damp ground. Shallow channels curve across mudflats scattered with shells. Birds step carefully beside pools left by the retreating tide. Farther out, Commencement Bay deepens into the broad waters now called Puget Sound. Here, at the southern end of that inland sea, stands the city of Tacoma. Yet long before streets crossed the hills, before railways reached the shore, and before docks extended into the bay, this was the homeland of the Puyallup people. The Puyallup call themselves Puyallupabj, commonly translated as people from the bend at the bottom of the river. The name evokes a geography of water and community. It refers to villages extending outward from the mouth and lower reaches of the Puyallup River, where winding channels offered passage between freshwater country and the saltwater shore. The Puyallup people understand their relationship with this homeland as reaching back since time immemorial. This phrase means more than a very long time. It describes a connection beyond the beginning of written records, held in family knowledge, language, teachings, and continuing responsibilities to land and water. Archaeological evidence in the wider Mount Rainier region shows indigenous use extending back at least 9,000 years. Such evidence offers one way of understanding the distant past. Alongside it are the histories carried by native communities themselves. These are histories of families and villages, journeys and agreements, and enduring relationships with the living world. This was never an empty landscape waiting to be discovered. It was a homeland known in careful detail. The river had its bends, shallows, and crossings. The shore had places where shellfish could be gathered and places where canoes could come ashore. Prairies, forests, creeks, islands, and mountain foothills belonged within a larger pattern of seasonal movement and tear. Names preserve knowledge of these places, while stories help teach how people should live within them. The Puyallup are among the Lushootseed-speaking peoples of the region. Lushootseed includes related language varieties spoken around much of Puget Sound. The Puyallup variety is often called Twilshootseed. Through language, places were more than points on a map. Their names could hold descriptions, memories, instructions, and relationships that later English names did not contain. Even the term Puget Sound came much later. It is a British name placed upon waters that already held indigenous names and meanings. Native peoples knew the coves, currents, islands, channels, and passages. The water was part of a familiar and deeply connected world. Rivers and marine waters supported travel, fishing, trade, family relationships, and seasonal gathering. Canoes moved along the lower river and across the saltwater channels, carrying people between villages and resource areas. Journeys helped maintain kinship and political relationships. They also supported extensive trade networks reaching far beyond the river mouth. Foods, materials, tools, technologies, arts, and knowledge traveled along these watery routes. Salmon were central to life along the river. They returned from the sea and traveled upstream, following a cycle that joined mountain water to the ocean. Their arrival brought nourishment, work, ceremony, and shared responsibility. People developed careful technologies for catching, preparing, drying, and storing fish. Knowledge of timing mattered. So did an understanding of the water, the season, the condition of the river, and the movements of each salmon run. Shellfish from the tidelands were also important foods. When the tide withdrew, clams and other marine resources could be gathered along the shore. Plants were collected in their proper seasons, and hunting took place in forests, prairies, and foothills. Life depended upon detailed knowledge carried across generations. Yet Puyallup life was far more than the gathering of food. Communities maintained political relationships, spiritual practices, artistic traditions, technologies, and systems of teaching. Families carried responsibilities and histories. Skilled hands made objects that were practical and beautiful, often at the same time. Cedar provided materials for canoes shaped for rivers and salt water. It also supplied houses, baskets, clothing, mats, ropes, tools, and many other useful objects. Working with cedar required close understanding of the tree and careful methods of harvesting. Wood could become the strong wall of a house or the smooth body of a canoe. Bark and roots could be prepared and woven. Within a single tree were many possibilities, recognized through patient experience. Around these human relationships, the landscape continued to shift. Commencement Bay lies within a deep basin shaped by glaciers. Long ago, immense ice moved across the region, pressing into the earth and helping form its valleys, slopes, and waterways. After the glaciers withdrew, rivers and tides continued the slow work of shaping the shore. The Puyallup River descends from glacial country on the mountain now officially called Mount Rainier. It carries fine sediment from the glaciers and high valleys. When the river reaches gentler ground near the bay, some of this material settles. Over time, the accumulating sediment has built a broad delta where the river reaches salt water. Before industrial development, much of the area now known as the tide flats consisted of wetlands, mudflats, tidal channels, and river habitat. The boundary between land and water was never entirely fixed. Tides covered the ground and uncovered it again. Channels shifted. Floods spread water and left new layers of soil. Landslides altered slopes, while river sediment gathered in changing patterns. Past volcanic debris flows also helped shape this country. These mixtures of water, earth, and volcanic material moved down from the mountain through river valleys. Across long spans of time, they contributed to the formation of the lowlands near the river. The ground beneath present-day Tacoma is therefore not a motionless foundation. It belongs to an ongoing story of ice, stone, sediment, tide, and flowing water. On a clear day, the mountain can be seen above the southeastern horizon. On many other days, it rests behind a soft cover of cloud. Sometimes only a pale section of snow appears. Then the clouds gather once more and the mountain quietly disappears. For the Puyallup and other native peoples connected with it, the mountain was never merely a distant scenic background. It was joined to rivers, travel, resources, stories, and spiritual relationships. Different tribes associated with the mountain have distinct names and pronunciations for it. Mount Rainier, Tacoma, and related indigenous forms should not be treated as exact synonyms, nor as words with one universally accepted spelling or meaning. Each belongs to a particular history of language and use. Whatever names are spoken, the physical connection between the mountain and the lower river is always present. Snow and glacial ice feed streams. Small streams enter larger channels. The river descends through forests and valleys until it reaches the broad delta. There, fresh water mingles with the salt water of the bay. This meeting of waters helped shape daily life. It offered pathways toward the interior and outward through the sound. It brought together fish, birds, plants, and people. Puyallup villages and resource areas extended from the shoreline toward mountain foothills, following rivers and creeks, crossing prairies, and reaching among islands. This homeland was understood through movement and relationship, rather than through the straight boundaries that would later be drawn on surveyed maps. The river connected one place to another. A canoe route could also be a family route, a trading route, or a path to a seasonal gathering place. The landscape held many overlapping meanings. Across generations, children learned the seasons by observing what returned. They watched the tides and the changing river. They noticed the flowering of plants and the movements of animals. Elders and other knowledgeable people taught the proper ways to travel, gather, make, share, and remember. The land was not separate from culture. It was where culture lived, and the Puyallup people remained here. Their history did not end when foreign ships appeared, nor when newcomers imposed different names and boundaries. The Puyallup tribe continues as a sovereign native nation, sustaining community, language, government, culture, and relationships with the river, the delta, and the bay. To begin Tacoma's history with this enduring presence changes the view of everything that follows. The city did not rise from an unused shore. It was built within an ancient homeland, beside waterways already traveled, named, understood, and cared for. For a long while, the familiar cycles continued. The tides entered the channels and slowly withdrew. Salmon moved between river and sea. Rain settled into the branches of cedar trees. Above the foothills, the mountain appeared for a moment through the clouds. Then ships carrying foreign flags began to enter the wider waters of the South Sound. Their crews brought unfamiliar place names, new forms of trade, and expanding systems of power. The river and bay continued their measured movement, even as another period of change began to gather along their shores. Chapter 2: Encounters, Treaties, and Change. On a winter morning near Medicine Creek, the sky can seem to rest close above the water. Gray clouds soften the edges of the forest. Smoke rises slowly from a fire, and the damp ground holds the marks of many footsteps. In December, daylight is brief, and the quiet waters of the South Sound reflect the pale colors of the season. Long before a council gathered here in 1854, these waterways connected indigenous communities across the region. The Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and neighboring peoples traveled by canoe, visited relatives, exchanged goods, and returned to familiar places for fishing, hunting, and gathering. Every inlet and river carried names, knowledge, and memories. What appeared on later maps as open territory was already a homeland, shaped by generations of care. When European vessels entered these waters, their officers recorded the landscape according to another system. In 1792, the British naval officer George Vancouver surveyed portions of the region. Lieutenant Peter Puget took part in Vancouver's expedition, exploring inland waters that British mapmakers would later associate with his name. The expedition did not discover an unnamed country. Instead, its members applied European names to places that already possessed indigenous names and meanings. This practice made distant officials and map readers feel that the region had become known to them. Yet the older knowledge remained, held in spoken histories, travel routes, fishing sites, and the relationships between communities and the land. In the decades that followed, ships arrived more regularly, carrying traders and goods from far beyond the Pacific Northwest. In 1833, the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Nisqually as a fur trading outpost. Despite its name, the original fort did not stand in the present-day city of Tacoma. It stood farther south, near what is now DuPont. Fort Nisqually became one point in a broad commercial network. Furs and other products moved outward from the South Sound, while manufactured goods arrived from distant markets. Company employees kept records and managed the trading post, but the fort could not have functioned without indigenous knowledge, labor, and participation. Native people brought food, traded furs, carried messages, guided travelers, and worked in farming and other activities around the post. They understood the seasons, the waterways, and the sources of food upon which everyone depended. The commercial network connected the South Sound to faraway places, but it also became part of an expanding system of outside power. Trade could be unequal, and distant governments increasingly claimed authority over lands they scarcely understood. 2 buildings from Fort Nisqually survived after the trading post itself declined. The Factor's House, used by the company's chief local official, and the Granary. Both structures were later moved to Point Defiance Park in Tacoma, where they became part of the Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. The museum is a place of preservation and interpretation. Its setting in Point Defiance Park is not the fort's original location. Beyond the trading post, change gathered steadily. American settlers crossed the continent and entered lands claimed by the United States. New farms and cabins appeared. Surveyors drew straight lines through forests, prairies, and river valleys. Those lines represented a system in which land could be divided, claimed, bought, and sold by individuals, often without regard for the communities already living there. In 1853, the United States created Washington Territory. Isaac Stevens served as territorial governor and at the same time as superintendent of Indian Affairs. Holding both positions gave him considerable authority. He was expected to prepare land for American settlement while negotiating treaties with the native nations whose homes occupied that same land. Treaty discussions at Medicine Creek began on December 24, 1854. The gathering took place in winter, amid cultural and linguistic differences that were not adequately bridged. The document known as the Treaty of Medicine Creek bears the date December 26, 1854. 2 days after the discussions began, representatives of the Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and other groups were asked to cede more than 2 million acres. To cede the land meant to surrender it under the terms asserted by the United States. In exchange, the written treaty described reservations, payments, services, and certain rights that native people would retain. It is important not to imagine this as a freely negotiated agreement between equal parties with equal choices. Territorial officials acted with the power of an expanding federal government behind them. Native representatives faced mounting pressure as newcomers entered their lands. Interpretation was inadequate, and access to written English was profoundly unequal. Many of the people whose names or marks appeared on the document could neither read nor write English. Tribal accounts and historians have described coercion surrounding the treaty discussions. Serious questions remain about the way some signatures or marks were obtained. Accounts raise the possibility that certain marks were forced or added improperly. The written document preserved the wording favored by American officials, but it could not fully preserve what Native leaders understood, what they opposed, or what they believed they had been promised. The original reservations established under the treaty were small and poorly situated. They did not adequately include the villages, fertile ground, fishing stations, and food gathering places upon which communities depended. Moving people away from such places meant far more than changing where they lived. It disrupted systems of nourishment, family connection, trade, ceremony, travel, and memory. Tensions deepened as settlers occupied more land and officials attempted to enforce the new arrangements. Conflict followed during 1855 and 1856. These events are often described more precisely as the Treaty Wars, rather than being placed under the older broad term, the Indian Wars. The more specific name helps reveal what was at stake. These conflicts grew from disputed treaties, the taking of land, and native resistance to policies imposed by territorial and federal authorities. The period brought displacement, fear, and hardship across the region. Even during this difficult time, Native leaders continued pressing for changes to the deeply unsuitable reservations. At the Fox Island Council in August 1856, reservation arrangements were reconsidered. The Puyallup Reservation was enlarged or relocated to include more useful land near the Puyallup River. Land near the river offered closer access to places important for food, movement, and community life. Yet the change did not restore the full Puyallup homeland, nor did it undo the unequal process through which more than 2 million acres had been claimed. The reservation occupied only a portion of the land and waters with which Puyallup life had long been connected. One provision of the treaty would become especially important in later generations. It said that Native people retained the right to fish at their usual and accustomed places. The treaty did not grant a new privilege to fish. It reserved a pre-existing right, one that Native communities had exercised long before the United States claimed authority in the region. Those few words carried enduring meaning. Salmon traveled beyond reservation boundaries, following rivers and seasons rather than survey lines. For the fishing promised to have real value, tribal fishers needed access to places outside the reservation. In later years, fishing rights became central to legal and political struggles, as the Puyallup and other treaty tribes defended their ability to continue fishing at those familiar places. The reserved land near the river also came under increasing pressure. Federal allotment policies divided communally held reservation land into individual parcels. Officials described allotment as a means of encouraging private farming and assimilation into American society. In practice, the policy made Native land easier to transfer out of tribal ownership. Land sales and fraud contributed to extensive losses. So did municipal growth, railroads, and industrial development. As Tacoma expanded, streets, homes, mills, rail lines, and warehouses spread across parts of the reservation and the surrounding homeland. Boundaries drawn on paper shifted again and again, while the river continued along its older course toward Commencement Bay. The reservation had never preserved the whole Puyallup land base. Over time, even much of the land within its boundaries passed away from tribal ownership or control. The loss was not the result of one moment alone. It unfolded through layers of federal policy, private transactions, dishonesty, public development, and the physical growth of the city. Still, the Puyallup people remained. They continued to fish and raise families. They maintained community ties, practiced their culture, governed themselves, and defended their rights. Their presence was not a fading remnant of an earlier time. It was, and remains, the continuing life of a sovereign Native nation. Policies intended to confine, divide, or absorb the tribe did not bring its history to an end. This continuity changes how the treaty period can be understood. It was a time of profound dispossession, but it was not a story of disappearance. The Treaty of Medicine Creek carried unequal terms and lasting consequences, yet its language also recorded rights that tribal people had reserved rather than surrendered. Across later generations, the treaty's words would return in council rooms, courts, and public debate. The waterways held another kind of record. Salmon continued to enter the river. Canoes and later fishing boats crossed familiar channels. Elders passed knowledge to younger generations, maintaining connections to remembered places even when access to those places became difficult. The European names printed on American maps became familiar to newcomers. Beneath and beside them remained older geographies of kinship, use, travel, and belonging. A river could be crossed by a survey line, yet it still flowed toward the sea. A fishing place could be enclosed by a new boundary, yet its meaning did not vanish. The knowledge of the land continued in memory and in practice. As the years after the treaty wars grew quieter, Commencement Bay continued to receive the tides. Forested slopes rose from the shore, and mist settled across the river flats. The Puyallup people remained in their homeland, fishing, governing, working, and raising new generations beside the river and bay. At the same time, new cabins and land claims began to appear along the water. Survey lines extended across places already known to Puyallup families. Newcomers looked toward the shoreline and imagined farms, businesses, and towns where villages, fishing grounds, and travel routes had long existed. The next shape of Tacoma was beginning to gather beside Commencement Bay, not upon empty ground, but within an enduring homeland whose first people were still there. Chapter 3. A Settlement Takes Shape. Rain rested lightly on the roof of a small cabin beside Commencement Bay. Nearby, two creeks moved through the forest, gathering water from the dark soil and carrying it toward a shallow lagoon. The lagoon formed a sheltered place along the shoreline, protected from some of the stronger winds and currents of the open bay. Canoes could approach and land there, as they had long done before any cabins stood among the trees. Historical sources record the place under the name Shubalup, or a similar spelling. The name was associated with shelter and with a protected place where canoes could come ashore. Like many indigenous place names later written down by English speakers, its sounds were represented in several ways, yet the variations pointed toward something local people understood through long experience. This was a useful curve of shore, a calm landing beside the larger bay. On December 25, 1864, a Euro-American settler named Job Carr arrived there. Carr was a veteran of the Union Army in the American Civil War. He had traveled west in the hope of beginning another chapter of his life. At the forested edge of Commencement Bay, he claimed 168 acres near the creeks and lagoon. Carr is often described as the first permanent Euro-American settler at the future city site. The wording matters. He was not the first human inhabitant of the place, nor was he the single founder of a community created on empty land. Puyallup people had lived around the bay, the rivers, and the nearby prairies for generations beyond counting. They continued to fish, travel, gather food, maintain family ties, and remain connected to their homeland. Carr's arrival marked the beginning of lasting Euro-American settlement at this particular shoreline. It did not mark the beginning of human life there. Other settlers had made claims in the wider area before him. During the conflicts of 1855 and 1856, however, earlier claims at the future Tacoma site had been abandoned. By the time Carr arrived, the open violence had subsided, though its consequences remained close. Treaty boundaries, survey lines, and new systems of land ownership were being placed across a much older geography of villages, fishing places, trails, and family relationships. Carr built his cabin close to the two creeks and the small lagoon. It was a modest structure in a wide and densely wooded setting. Cedar, fir, and hemlock rose around it. Beyond the near shore, Commencement Bay opened toward the inland waters of Puget Sound. On clear days, the mountain stood above the southeastern horizon. It seemed near enough to belong to every view, although its slopes were many miles away. Carr called his little settlement Eureka. The word was often used by newcomers in the West to express discovery or hopeful satisfaction. Yet, Carr's greatest hope concerned something that had not arrived at all. He believed that a transcontinental railroad might one day reach Puget Sound. He also believed that Commencement Bay, with its broad harbor and deep water, might be chosen as the railroad's western end. At the time, this was an expectation, rather than a certainty. Railroad companies studied possible routes across difficult country, while towns and landowners promoted one harbor over another. Maps carried lines that had not yet been built. Investors described future depots, docks, and streets, even while much of the shoreline was still reached by canoe, boat, or rough trail. Carr understood that a railway terminus could transform the scale of settlement. A terminus was more than the point where tracks ended. It could become a place where passengers and freight moved between trains and ships. Warehouses might follow, along with stores, hotels, workshops, and homes. Land that had seemed distant from major markets could suddenly become valuable. For the moment, though, the hoped-for railroad remained only an idea. Rain continued to move across the bay. The creeks entered the lagoon. Smoke rose from the cabin and drifted among the trees. The scale of everyday life was still small, even as large ambitions began to gather around it. In 1868, another settler and town promoter arrived. His name was Morton Matthew McCarver. McCarver had experience in establishing and promoting towns elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. He saw in Commencement Bay many of the possibilities Carr had imagined, but he approached the landscape with the practiced eye of a town planner and promoter. Where Carr had built a cabin near a protected landing, McCarver imagined blocks, lots, roads, and commercial property. McCarver purchased much of Carr's claim and began promoting a formal town site. In December 1869, he filed the plat for Tacoma City. A plat is a mapped plan that divides land into streets, blocks, and individual lots. On paper, portions of the forested slope became an orderly town. Straight lines crossed uneven ground, giving visible shape to ambitions that were still waiting for buildings, residents, and investment. The name Tacoma connected the settlement with the mountain overlooking the region. It was derived from a native associated name for that mountain, though the path of the word is not simple or entirely certain. Its pronunciation, spelling, and meaning have been interpreted in different ways. Native language experts and scholars have not always agreed on a single explanation. The English form may have passed through several listeners and writers before appearing on maps and documents. It is therefore best not to give the name one simple and certain translation. Instead, Tacoma can be understood as a word shaped through a longer meeting of indigenous and settler languages. Like many names written during this period, it carried traces of older knowledge, while also revealing how native words were heard, altered, and recorded by newcomers. McCarver promoted Tacoma City as a likely destination for the railroad. He wrote, planned, and encouraged interest in the town site. Yet the final choice belonged to the Northern Pacific Railroad, a powerful corporation supported by private investment and extensive federal land grants. The company was building toward the Pacific coast and considering where its western terminus should be placed. The waiting lasted for years. Around the bay, tides rose and fell, as they always had. A few new structures appeared. Paths became more familiar. The small settlement remained quiet, but its promoters continued to look toward a future of arriving trains. Then on July 14, 1873, the announcement came. The Northern Pacific Railroad had selected Commencement Bay as its western terminus. The broad hope had been fulfilled. The railway was coming to the bay. Yet one important detail soon tempered the celebration. The company did not choose McCarver's existing town site as the center of its development. Instead, the Northern Pacific selected land farther south along the shoreline and began creating a separate settlement of its own. That company settlement became known as New Tacoma. McCarver's earlier town site, gathered around Carr's cabin, the lagoon, and the original plat became Old Tacoma, or Old Town. The relationship between the two places can be pictured by looking along the western shore of Commencement Bay. Old Tacoma stood to the north, near the protected shoreline where Carr had settled. New Tacoma arose farther south, closer to the land chosen for railroad yards, wharves, offices, and related businesses. Between the two lay sloping ground and stretches of forest. Roads and buildings would eventually fill much of that space. For a time, however, Old Tacoma and New Tacoma were clearly separate places, each with its own center and its own expectations. The railroad decision changed the scale of activity along the bay. Survey stakes appeared among the trees. Work crews cleared routes and shaped the ground for tracks. Timber was cut both as a product and to make room for construction. The measured sounds of axes and hammers joined the quieter sounds of rain, tide, wind, and running water. A lone cabin had marked one kind of settlement, A mapped town site had suggested another. Now the railroad introduced a much larger arrangement of company land, transportation corridors, industrial spaces, and planned streets. The shape of the future city was no longer guided only by individual claims and local hopes. It was also being directed by a corporation with distant investors and extensive property. In December 1873, the first rail connection from Calama reached Tacoma. Calama stood on the Columbia River to the south, and the new line connected Commencement Bay with a growing regional network. The arrival was significant, but it did not complete the promised transcontinental system. Tacoma had gained a working rail connection, while the full route across the continent remained unfinished. The same year that brought the terminus announcement also brought a severe financial crisis. The Panic of 1873 moved through banks, investment firms, and railroad companies. Northern Pacific encountered serious financial trouble, and construction slowed. Grand predictions met the quieter limits of debt, distance, and uncertain markets. Tacoma's railway beginning therefore contained both arrival and delay. Tracks had reached the bay, but the larger system was still incomplete. Land values rose with expectation, while investors waited for greater stability. Buildings appeared, though not always as quickly as promoters had promised. The terminus was real, but its meaning would unfold gradually. The relationship between Tacoma and the Northern Pacific would remain equally complicated. The railroad brought transportation, jobs, new residents, and commercial connections. It helped link the bay with inland farms, forests, mines, and ocean shipping. It encouraged the construction of warehouses, workshops, stores, boarding houses, and homes. At the same time, the Northern Pacific owned extensive land and exercised substantial influence over urban development. Its decisions affected where tracks ran, where industries gathered, and where streets and neighborhoods took shape. Choices made in company offices could alter the everyday geography of the growing settlement. Tacoma benefited from the railroad, but it also lived under a considerable measure of railroad control. And beneath the company holdings were lands that had never been unoccupied. The arrival of the railroad did not mean that it had selected an empty place. They encountered tracks crossing familiar routes, new boundaries around fishing places, and expanding settlements beside the water. Railroad maps emphasized property lines and commercial opportunity, but those maps could not erase the older geography of rivers, villages, gathering grounds, travel, and kinship. Along the bay, Old Tacoma and New Tacoma faced a shared shoreline, while following different plans. One had grown from Carr's Cabin and McCarver's town site. The other had been laid out around the needs of a powerful railroad. In time, their roads and communities would draw closer, though their separate beginnings would continue to influence Tacoma's identity. Near the old lagoon, the creeks still found their way toward the tide. Rain passed over cabin roofs, newly cleared ground, and freshly laid rails alike. Beyond them, the mountain remained above the horizon, carrying older names even as one form of its name was adapted for the town below. From the railroad yards, the tracks led along the bay and toward the rising land. Around them, scattered claims slowly became streets. Shops opened near work sites. Boarding houses received new arrivals. Old Tacoma and New Tacoma each looked toward a future that remained uncertain, yet increasingly connected. The financial troubles of 1873 had slowed the larger dream, but they had not ended it. The rails were present now. So were the company lands, the survey stakes, and the beginnings of competing town centers. In the years ahead, settlement would spread uphill and along the water. Businesses, neighborhoods, and public institutions would gather around the tracks. From the uneasy promise of a western terminus, Tacoma would begin to form a larger civic idea of itself, until the settlement beside Commencement Bay came to be promoted as a city shaped by destiny. Chapter 4: The City of Destiny. On a misty morning near the railway station, the waiting room filled with the quiet movement of arrivals and departures. Damp coats rested heavily on travelers' shoulders. Leather cases stood beside wooden benches, while trunks and parcels waited beneath handwritten labels. Newspapers passed from one reader to another, carrying reports of distant cities, railway schedules, and local property sales. Outside, iron wheels rolled slowly over wet rails. Steam drifted into the cool air and mingled with the low clouds above Commencement Bay. Beyond the station, forested slopes rose from the shoreline, their upper reaches softened by rain. The railway had drawn people toward Tacoma, but it had also helped create an unusual civic landscape. For a time, there were two neighboring communities along the bay. Tacoma City, often called Old Tacoma, had been incorporated in 1875. It grew near the earlier settlement associated with Job Carr and Morton McCarver. Farther south, New Tacoma developed around the Northern Pacific Railway's planned terminus. It soon had streets, businesses, and civic institutions of its own. The distance between the two communities was not great, yet each wished to become the center of the growing region. They competed for stores, investment, residence, and public standing. A merchant deciding where to open a shop had to consider which place might attract more customers. A family choosing land might weigh proximity to the railway yards against the familiarity of the older waterfront settlement. Each community had supporters who believed its streets should guide Tacoma's future. As settlement spread, however, the boundaries between Old Tacoma and New Tacoma became less practical. Roads and buildings began to occupy the spaces between them. Their economies were already connected, and both depended on the same harbor, the same railway, and many of the same workers. The territorial legislature ordered the communities to consolidate. On January 7, 1884, the union took effect, creating one city of Tacoma. A legal boundary could change in a day, though habits and local loyalties took longer to soften. Old Tacoma and New Tacoma continued to retain distinct characters. People still remembered which community they had joined first, and which streets they considered their own. Yet the consolidated city could now plan, seek investment, and promote itself under one name. The timing seemed especially favorable. The Northern Pacific had completed its transcontinental connection in 1883, opening a continuous railway route across the northern part of the country. Ceremonies marked the event, and newspaper reports gave it a sense of national importance. Passengers, letters, manufactured goods, and news could travel overland along the railway, linking the Pacific coast more closely with distant inland cities. For Tacoma's promoters, the completed connection seemed to confirm what they had hoped for when the railroad selected Commencement Bay as its western terminus. Ceremonies and publicity encouraged visions of Tacoma becoming a major center of Pacific commerce. Promotional pamphlets praised the harbor, the surrounding timber, the railway access, and the nearby valleys. Maps displayed orderly streets where stumps, mud, and construction debris might still be found. Illustrations showed large buildings, crowded docks, and busy ships. Possibilities were presented as though they had already become permanent facts. Out of this confidence came Tacoma's best-known promotional nickname, the City of Destiny. The phrase expressed the belief that the railroad had selected Tacoma for inevitable greatness, as if geography and steel rails had already written the city's future. It was a memorable claim, but it was promotional language, not an objective judgment. Cities do not move along a fixed path simply because a railway company, a newspaper, or a group of investors expects them to do so. Tacoma's growth depended on markets, labor, public decisions, natural resources, and events far beyond the bay. The language of destiny made uncertainty sound certain. It could inspire investment, but it could also conceal the difficult and uneven work beneath the city's expansion. For a time, signs of growth appeared almost everywhere. Hotels welcomed travelers arriving by train or steamship. Stores offered fabric, household tools, books, lamps, and food from nearby farms. Banks opened offices beneath carefully painted signs. Newspapers reported on elections, shipping, real estate, social gatherings, and competing plans for new streets. Churches and schools appeared among houses and commercial blocks. Elaborate public buildings were planned and constructed to express confidence in the city's future. Their solid walls and ornamented entrances suggested stability, even while much of Tacoma remained unfinished. Newcomers arrived from elsewhere in the United States, as well as from Europe, Asia, and Canada. Some came with savings, business connections, or established professions. Others stepped from the train carrying little more than a case, a trade, or the address of a relative. Many languages could be heard in boarding houses, shocks, kitchens, and work sites. Each newcomer encountered a place still being made, where opportunity existed beside insecurity, prejudice, and exclusion. The city might appear open and full of promise, but it did not offer the same safety or possibility to everyone. Development climbed away from the shoreline. Downtown streets gathered close to the railway and harbor, while homes spread across the steep slopes above them. In time, this became one of Tacoma's most recognizable physical patterns. Water and industry lay below. Commercial streets rose inland. Residential neighborhoods looked down toward the bay. When the clouds lifted, the higher ground offered broad views across the water. Mount Tacoma could appear beyond the rooftops, pale and distant above the busy city. Yet building on those slopes required enormous effort. Streets had to be graded. High ground was cut down, while lower places were filled to create more usable routes. Soil, stone, tree roots, and construction materials were moved by workers across uneven ground. Wooden sidewalks crossed stretches of mud. Retaining walls supported altered hillsides, and supplies had to be carried upward from the waterfront. Construction also changed the movement of rainwater. Natural channels and shallow hollows were buried, redirected, or crossed by roads. Water that had once followed a gradual path toward the bay could collect beside newly formed embankments. Drains, culverts, and sewers became necessary parts of city building, though the need for them was sometimes understood only after streets and structures were already in place. The transformation demanded extensive physical labor. Workers laid track, lifted timber, dug foundations, graded streets, and carried supplies uphill. Others handled goods in warehouses, served meals in hotels, cleaned rooms, printed newspapers, kept shops, taught children, or worked behind the counters of new offices. Many jobs were insecure. A worker might find employment on one project and lose it when the work ended or financing disappeared. Conditions in the railway yards, mills, construction sites, and along the waterfront could be dangerous. Wages did not always keep pace with housing costs, and rapid growth could make rent and basic goods more expensive. The boom then did not bring universal prosperity. A new bank building might suggest stability, while workers nearby waited to learn whether another shift would be offered. An elaborate hotel lobby could receive prosperous travelers, while families in modest rooms counted the days until payday. The city's public image was polished in advertisements, but ordinary life depended on uncertain markets and long hours of work. Even so, Tacoma's streets remained full of plans. Investors purchased land in the expectation that prices would continue to rise. Builders began increasingly ambitious structures. Among them was a great luxury hotel on a bluff above Commencement Bay. Its location offered sweeping views of the water, the city, and the distant landscape. The building was intended to welcome affluent travelers and stand as evidence that Tacoma had joined the ranks of important western cities. Its walls rose on a grand scale, suited to the confidence of the era. From its windows, future guests might have looked across railway lines and ships, seeing the systems that had helped create the boom. They might have watched clouds drift above the bay and evening lights appear along the streets below. Yet the future imagined for those rooms did not arrive as planned. In 1893, a severe financial panic spread across the country. Banks failed, and credit became difficult to obtain. Railroad companies faced serious financial trouble. Investors who had depended on continuing growth discovered how quickly confidence could disappear. In Tacoma, construction slowed or stopped. Businesses closed, unemployment rose, and property values fell. Some owners were left with debts attached to land that could no longer be sold at the expected price. Projects that had seemed certain were postponed, reduced, or abandoned. The change was sharp, though people experienced it through ordinary days. A building crew did not return to a work site. A shopkeeper saw fewer customers. A household postponed a needed purchase. Relatives shared rooms to reduce expenses. Newspapers that had once printed confident forecasts now carried reports of failed banks, lost employment, and stalled construction. Above the bay, the luxury hotel remained unfinished. Its empty openings faced the weather. Rain darkened the masonry, and wind moved around walls intended to shelter guests. The building had been designed as a monument to arrival, yet it stood instead as a reminder that expectation and history are not the same. Below it, trains continued to pass. The tide still entered Commencement Bay and withdrew again. Clouds settled over the water, lifted from the hills, and returned with the changing weather. But the great hotel waited without guests. There was something quiet and instructive in that pause. The unfinished rooms held the outline of a future that had once seemed assured. Now they looked over a city adjusting to uncertainty. The structure would not remain empty forever. In time, it would be adapted and completed for another purpose, becoming Stadium High School. Its later life would show how a city could reuse the remains of one era to serve the needs of another. During the Depression of the 1890s, however, it remained a large and visible sign of interrupted confidence. Tacoma endured the downturn. People continued to work when work was available. They traded, taught, worshipped, organized, and cared for their households. The railway remained, and the harbor still connected the city to forests, farms, inland towns, and distant ports. Yet the difficult years made one truth plain. Tacoma's future was neither smooth nor guaranteed. It would be shaped not by destiny alone, but by labor, public choices, conflict, endurance, changing markets, and the daily actions of people whose names rarely appeared in promotional pamphlets. From the high streets and the unfinished hotel windows, the view descended once more toward the water. Beneath drifting smoke and coastal cloud, lumber waited beside the tracks, rail cars moved through the yards, cargo passed between warehouses and ships. Along the working waterfront, long days of physical labor gave the growing city much of its steady rhythm. And there, close to the tide, Tacoma's next chapter was already taking shape among timber, rails, machinery, and the quiet movement of vessels across Commencement Bay. Chapter 5. Timber, Rails, and a Working Waterfront. In the pale light of morning, before the machinery began its daily motion, rafts of logs rested on the calm water of Commencement Bay. Long trunks floated side by side, gathered into broad platforms, and secured with chains and heavy ropes. Mist settled gently over the bay, softening the outlines of mills, warehouses, railway cars, and waiting ships. Beyond them, forested hills rose toward Tacoma's neighborhoods. Farther south, the mountain called Tacoma stood above the horizon. For a little while, the harbor seemed almost still. Then a mill whistle sounded across the water. Doors opened, and footsteps crossed wooden platforms. Steam gathered around engines. Belts began to turn, and saws entered timber with a steady mechanical note. In the railway yards, bells rang as cars moved slowly into position. Ropes tightened around posts. Sailors called measured instructions. Carts rolled along the docks, and workers made their way into mills, sheds, warehouses, and offices. Tacoma's working waterfront awakened gradually, sound by sound. Saws, rail bells, steam, ropes, and footsteps joined the quieter movement of the tide. Timber formed the foundation of much of Tacoma's early industrial economy. The forests of western Washington contained immense stands of cedar, fir, and hemlock. Logging crews cut trees throughout the surrounding region and moved the timber toward rivers, railway lines, and sheltered water. From there, the logs reached mills along parts of Commencement Bay. Mill hands sorted and sawed them into boards, beams, shingles, and other useful forms. Some of the finished lumber remained nearby. Tacoma's houses, shops, docks, warehouses, and public buildings required great quantities of wood. Much more traveled beyond the city. Railways carried logs and finished wood products inland and eastward across the continent. Ships carried lumber toward other Pacific ports and to distant regions of the world. The railway and harbor worked together, each extending the reach of the other. Timber cut in a forest could travel by water or rail to Tacoma, pass through a mill beside the bay, and begin another journey as finished lumber. A board produced along Commencement Bay might eventually become part of a building hundreds or thousands of miles away. Yet the waterfront handled far more than wood. Grain facilities received crops from farms east of the Cascade Mountains. Warehouses held food, tools, household goods, and industrial materials. Foundries shaped metal for machinery and construction. Shipyards repaired vessels and, at times, built them. Fisheries prepared catches for sale and shipment. Railway yards connected these activities through a widening network of tracks, sidings, switching points, sheds, and loading platforms. The people who sustained this economy came from many backgrounds. There were loggers and mill hands, longshore workers and railway crews, sailors, and mechanics. Clerks kept records of cargo, wages, orders, arrivals, and departures. Domestic workers maintained households and boarding houses where laborers found rooms. Laundry workers cleaned clothing marked by smoke, rain, grease, and sawdust. Cooks and food vendors prepared meals for people whose shifts began early in the morning or ended late at night. Immigrants worked alongside people born in the region. Indigenous people participated in waterfront trades and in the wider economy while maintaining enduring relationships with their communities and homelands. Asian workers carried out difficult industrial and service work, even as they faced organized discrimination. Women's labor, often poorly recorded in official accounts, supported both industry and household life. Women took in laundry, kept lodging houses, prepared food, managed small businesses, cared for children, and worked in factories and processing facilities. The waterfront was not simply an anonymous crowd moving between large machines. It was made of individuals, each with routines, responsibilities, and relationships extending beyond the mill gate or warehouse door. A railway worker might leave home before daylight, carrying food wrapped for the shift ahead. A laundry worker might plan her hours around the return of garments needed for someone else's workday. A clerk might spend the morning checking columns of figures before walking home through streets lined with modest houses. A cook might prepare a meal while listening for the whistle that marked the changing shift. Families arranged meals, errands, childcare, and rest around schedules set by ships, trains, tides, and machinery. The sounds of industry entered household life. A whistle announced the opening or closing of a shift. Railway bells carried uphill from the yards. At night, the distant movement of cars and engines could continue after other parts of the city had grown quiet. Those schedules were not always dependable. Employment rose and fell with seasons, orders, and wider economic conditions. A mill could reduce its hours when demand weakened. A delayed ship might leave dock workers waiting without pay. Seasonal layoffs unsettled household budgets, while illness or injury could affect an entire family. Neighborhood stores sometimes extended credit to familiar customers, trusting that payment would arrive when work resumed. Boarding house keepers adjusted meals and room arrangements as workers came and went. News passed from one household to another about which mill was hiring, which vessel was expected, and where a few days of work might be found. Longshore work could be especially irregular. Longshore workers loaded and unloaded ships, moving sacks, crates, barrels, timber, and machinery between a vessel's deck, its hold, the dock, a warehouse, and a railway car. Much of this labor was performed by hand or with relatively simple lifting equipment. Cargo had to be positioned, balanced, and secured with care. The dock was crowded with ropes, carts, winches, and shifting loads, while the hold of a ship could be confined and difficult to work within. Hiring systems often gave employers or labor contractors considerable control over who received a shift. Workers might gather and wait without knowing whether they would be selected that day. A person who was not chosen could return home with no wages, even after spending hours near the docks. This uncertainty encouraged demands for fairer hiring, steadier pay, and greater dignity in the distribution of work. Waterfront laborers organized to seek higher wages, shorter hours, safer workplaces, and more influence over the hiring process. In March of 1886, Tacoma longshore workers struck the Tacoma Mill Company. Their concerns included low wages, long hours, and the question of representation. The strike formed part of a broader labor history in which workers found that acting together could give them a voice that was difficult to exercise alone. Labor organization brought meaningful improvements over time, but its history was not simple. Unions could protect workers from arbitrary treatment and press employers for safer conditions, better wages, and shorter days. At the same time, some labor organizations participated in racial exclusion. They treated the security of one group as though it depended on denying work, membership, or opportunity to another. The language of solidarity did not always include indigenous, Asian, and other workers who helped sustain the waterfront economy. Tacoma's labor history therefore contained both cooperation and exclusion. Each shaped the city, and neither can be left out of its story. The reasons for seeking safer conditions were plain. Industrial work placed people near heavy timber, exposed machinery, sharp tools, hot metal, unstable cargo, and moving railway cars. Wooden mills and warehouses were vulnerable to fire. Dust, smoke, and industrial fumes affected the air. Rain made outdoor surfaces slippery, and long shifts could make careful attention more difficult to maintain. The scale of production could appear impressive from a distance. Stacks of lumber rose beside the tracks. Ships waited under tall masts and rigging. Warehouses stretched along the shore. Yet every loaded vessel and every departing railway car depended on sustained physical effort in surroundings that could be unforgiving. Families experienced these risks even when they remained far from the docks. A delayed return home could bring worry. An injury might mean lost income, additional care, and uncertain months ahead. An industrial whistle could carry several meanings. It might mark the ordinary beginning of a shift, announce the day's end, or sound a warning that drew attention toward the waterfront. Still, neighborhoods near the industrial districts developed steady forms of community. Small groceries served familiar households. Boarding houses provided rooms close to employment. Places of worship, mutual aid societies, and cultural associations helped newcomers find companionship and assistance. Information traveled along sidewalks and across kitchen tables. People shared news of a newly arrived vessel, a mill in need of workers, a merchant offering lower prices, or a family requiring help. These quiet networks softened some of the uncertainty that accompanied waterfront life. The waters themselves continued to provide food and livelihood. Commercial fishing fleets brought catches to market, but fishing around Tacoma was never only an industrial business. For the Puyallup and other indigenous peoples, fishing was protected by treaty and rooted in traditions far older than the city. Salmon and other fish sustained families, communities, trade, and ceremony. Treaty fishing rights were repeatedly challenged, but they remained living rights, not merely memories from an earlier time. Other families also fished for household sustenance. A catch carried home could reduce the need for store-bought food and maintain a familiar connection with the shore. The rivers, tidal flats, and bay had supported human life for generations, yet the expanding industrial waterfront placed growing pressure on those waters. The Puyallup River Delta had once opened into a broad pattern of tidal flats, wetlands, and winding channels. Fresh water met salt water gradually there, creating habitat for fish, birds, plants, and many smaller forms of life. Tides moved through the delta each day, covering and revealing stretches of mud and marsh. As Tacoma's industries expanded, people reshaped this landscape to serve mills, railways, docks, warehouses, and ships. Channels were dredged. Sediment was removed to deepen the water and make room for vessels. Wetlands were filled with earth and industrial material to create firm ground. Railway tracks crossed places where tidal water had once flowed. The shoreline became straighter and more fixed, arranged according to commercial needs, property lines, and industrial maps. These changes brought jobs and wealth to Tacoma. They also eliminated wetlands and damaged the habitat on which fish and other species depended. The transformation accumulated one project at a time. A person might notice a single new track, a newly filled channel, another warehouse, or a longer dock. Over the years, however, these individual alterations remade much of the natural delta. By the early 20th century, the waterfront had become a dense industrial landscape. Railway cars stood where marsh grasses had once bent with the tides. Warehouses cast long shadows across filled ground. Smoke drifted above mill roofs. Ships waited beside constructed piers, and cargo passed steadily between water and rail. Tacoma's prosperity was tied closely to this altered shore and to the many people whose labor kept goods moving through it. The same development that supported households and connected the city with distant markets also narrowed tidal channels, removed wetlands, and damaged fish habitat. Opportunity and loss occupied the same landscape. As evening settled over Commencement Bay, the saws quieted one by one. Railway bells became less frequent, though some crews continued into the night. Workers walked home or toward boarding houses. Cooks cleared tables, laundry dried for another day, and families listened for familiar footsteps. Beneath the docks, water continued to move around pilings and stone. The tide followed an older rhythm, passing quietly through what remained of the channels beside the filled ground, the tracks, and the warehouses. The working harbor had opened opportunities, but those opportunities had never been offered equally. As Tacoma grew busier and more confident, a harder question waited behind its mills, streets, and civic promises. Who would be allowed to share in the city's future, and who would be deliberately pushed away? Chapter 6: Belonging and Exclusion. Along Tacoma's early waterfront, everyday life began quietly. A merchant opened a shop near the bay and arranged familiar foods upon the shelves. In a laundry, water was heated, clothing was sorted, and clean garments were prepared for customers returning later in the day. Gardeners tended small plots in the damp soil, while cooks prepared meals for people coming in from rail yards, logging camps, mills, and ships. Nearby, the tide rose around pilings and narrow reaches of shore. Chinese residents had been part of this growing community since Tacoma's earliest years. Some Chinese merchants lived there by the early 1870s, before the city had acquired many of the buildings and public institutions that would later seem to define it. Others arrived through the broad network of railroad construction that was changing the western United States. On the western division of the Northern Pacific Railway, roughly two-thirds of the laborers were Chinese. Their work helped carry the tracks across difficult country toward Commencement Bay. They cleared routes, moved earth, laid ties, and performed much of the demanding physical labor upon which the railway depended. Yet to describe these people only as railroad workers would leave out the fullness of their lives. Chinese residents worked in logging and laundries, domestic service and gardening. They grew and prepared food, collected refuse, operated restaurants, and conducted trade. Some moved from one kind of work to another as Tacoma's economy changed. Some established businesses and became familiar to customers who saw them day after day. They were neighbors, merchants, workers, and members of families. Their lives held ordinary concerns: earning a living, sharing meals, writing letters, caring for relatives, maintaining friendships, and seeking a secure place within a city still taking shape. Tacoma benefited from their skill, knowledge, and labor. Its railroad, homes, businesses, and daily services depended upon many hands. But belonging was not determined by contribution alone. Even as Chinese residents helped sustain the growing city, organized racism increasingly threatened their ability to remain there. Across the nation, economic anxiety and anti-Chinese prejudice intensified after railroad construction slowed. Competition for work became sharper, and Chinese laborers were blamed for conditions they had not created. Fear was directed toward a visible community, while racial exclusion was presented as an answer to wider economic uncertainty. In Tacoma, the campaign against Chinese residents was neither sudden nor accidental. Politicians, newspapers, business leaders, and some labor organizations helped organize it. They treated an entire community as though it were a problem to be removed. Meetings were held, plans were announced. A deadline was established for Chinese residents to leave. This was organized racism presented as civic policy. Its supporters spoke of order, but their purpose was coercion. About 150 Chinese residents departed under threat before the deadline. Their leaving was not a free decision made under ordinary circumstances. They understood that remaining could place their homes, livelihoods, and personal safety at risk. A few Tacoma residents spoke in opposition. Ezra Meeker objected to the campaign, as did Reverend W.D. McFarland. Their dissent is worth remembering because it shows that opposition was possible. People living at the time could recognize the injustice and choose not to support it. Yet these voices were too few, and they could not halt what the anti-Chinese organizers had prepared. Then came the date that would remain a lasting part of Tacoma's history: November 3, 1885. On that day, a mob gathered. It included prominent civic figures as well as other residents. Approximately 200 Chinese people who remained in Tacoma were forced from their homes. They were marched to transportation that would carry them away from the city. Their waterfront homes and buildings were subsequently burned. This was a forced expulsion. It was not a voluntary departure, a moment of vague tension, or merely a controversy between two sides. People who had lived and worked in Tacoma were driven out because they were Chinese. They lost homes, businesses, community ties, and the freedom to continue their lives in a place they had helped to build. For a moment, it is worth leaving the shoreside quiet. The tide still moved beside the altered waterfront. Rain still crossed the bay, and trains still passed through the city. Yet the familiar routines of a community had been interrupted. Shops did not open as before. Gardens were no longer tended by the same hands. Customers no longer met the merchants they had known. Homes and gathering places disappeared, leaving an absence that later growth could conceal, but could not erase. The organizers promoted what they had done as the Tacoma method. They presented planned coercion as an orderly civic solution. The phrase softened the reality, making racial expulsion sound like practical municipal action. It turned deliberate injustice into something its supporters could describe as organized, respectable, and worthy of imitation. But orderly language did not make the act just. The involvement of civic figures did not make it lawful or humane. Planning did not lessen the harm. It only showed how exclusion could be carried out through public cooperation, with institutions and influential residents working together against a vulnerable community. Legal proceedings followed. People responsible for the expulsion were indicted, meaning they were formally accused of crimes. The cases, however, were eventually dropped. No courtroom outcome restored what had been taken. The waterfront community did not return as it had been, and Tacoma continued forward with a profound absence along its shore. New streets, mills, houses, and public buildings could make that absence easier to overlook. A city can cover difficult ground with construction and still carry the history beneath it. Names may disappear from directories, shops may vanish from maps, a path once walked each morning may become part of an industrial yard or an altered shoreline. Yet the loss remains within the story of the place, even when it is no longer readily visible. The expulsion also raises a wider question about the meaning of community. Tacoma's promoters described the city as a place of possibility, shaped by rail connections, natural resources, commerce, and determined effort. But possibility was distributed unevenly. Some residents were invited to imagine themselves as builders and citizens. Others were valued for their labor, while being denied security, dignity, and a lasting home. The events of 1885 stand out because of their deliberate coordination. Civic leadership was used not to protect Chinese residents, but to remove them. Newspapers, politicians, business leaders, and organizations helped create the conditions in which a community could be threatened, displaced, and then spoken of as though its departure had been a reasonable public decision. More than a century passed before Tacoma offered a formal acknowledgement of this wrongdoing. In 1993, the Tacoma City Council recognized the injustice and supported a process of reconciliation. That acknowledgement did not reverse the expulsion. It could not return lost property, restore interrupted businesses, or recreate the community that had been scattered. It did, however, mark a change in how the city chose to remember. From this reconciliation process came the development of Chinese Reconciliation Park, near the site of the former waterfront settlement. The location matters. It brings remembrance back toward the bay, close to the ground where Chinese residents once worked, traded, prepared food, washed clothes, tended gardens, operated businesses, and made homes. Within the park are paths, gardens, stonework, interpretive spaces, and a traditional Chinese pavilion. These features invite visitors to move slowly through the landscape. Plantings offer quiet, seasonal change. Stone suggests endurance and the weight of memory. Interpretive spaces explain the expulsion and place it within the larger history of Chinese life in Tacoma. The pavilion faces the water, providing a sheltered place from which to look across Commencement Bay. A reconciliation park cannot settle every question raised by the past. Memorialization does not undo loss. Acknowledgement does not restore the expelled community. Nor does it mean that Tacoma became fully inclusive simply by recognizing what happened. Belonging cannot be secured by a single statement, ceremony, or public space. It must be renewed through attention, honesty, and the choices made in each generation. Still, remembrance has value. It can return people and experiences to a history from which they were once pushed aside. It can challenge softened accounts and replace them with plain truth. It can help a city understand itself more fully, not as a place following a simple path from hardship toward improvement, but as a community shaped by labor and ambition, welcome and exclusion, silence and renewed attention. At Chinese Reconciliation Park, the landscape offers room for this quieter understanding. Water approaches the shore and draws away again. Rain darkens the stones. Leaves settle along the paths, and gardens change with the seasons. Beneath the pavilion roof, visitors may pause and look toward the working harbor, where vessels pass through waters known by generations before Tacoma had its present name. The bay does not erase what occurred beside it, nor can the movement of time make a forced departure voluntary. The calm surface of the water exists alongside the difficult memory of November 3, 1885, and alongside the lives of Chinese residents who were workers, merchants, neighbors, and families before they were driven away. From these quiet paths of remembrance, Tacoma's streets begin again. Beyond the shoreline lie parks, schools, libraries, houses of worship, and public gathering places that grew as the city entered a new century. These civic spaces offered connection and shared life to many, though their doors and promises remained unevenly opened. The history continued there, among trees and classrooms, streetcar lines and neighborhood streets. And as Tacoma expanded outward from the bay, the city would keep facing the same enduring question: how a public place might become not merely impressive or prosperous, but genuinely shared. Chapter 7. A Civic City Emerges. Beneath the trees of Wright Park, Tacoma seems to move at a gentler pace. Leaves shift in the damp air, and branches hold small drops of rain. Along the curving paths, people pass beneath maples, oaks, and evergreens, while the ponds reflect quiet portions of the sky. A century ago, a distant streetcar bell might have sounded beyond the trees, followed by the low rolling of wheels along steel rails. The park developed from a gift of 27 acres associated with Charles Barstow Wright, a leader of the Northern Pacific Railway. Its lawns, paths, ponds, and growing collection of trees offered room for walking, conversation, play, and rest near the center of Tacoma. Though shaped as a public landscape, the park still carried something of the wider region. There was moisture on the bark, soft ground beneath the trees, and the gray light familiar beside Puget Sound. Yakima Avenue originally crossed directly through Wright Park. Streetcars and pedestrians made the grounds accessible from downtown and nearby neighborhoods. As automobiles became more common, however, their passage through the park brought new concerns. In the 1920s, automobile traffic was removed, creating more room for recreation and allowing the paths and lawns to feel quieter. Wright Park was one part of a broad civic effort. As Tacoma grew, residents established public schools, libraries, religious congregations, clubs, theaters, hospitals, charitable institutions, and neighborhood organizations. Together, these places gave a more settled shape to daily life. Children learned in classrooms. Families found care in hospitals and charitable organizations. Congregations gathered for worship and fellowship. Clubs and theaters offered conversation, music, performance, and companionship. Some institutions were established through public action, others began in rented rooms, storefronts, or private homes. A congregation might meet in a modest space before constructing a permanent building. A club might gather around a table before opening a hall of its own. Charitable work could begin with a small group of people bringing food, medicine, or assistance from one household to another. Over time, these separate efforts formed a civic network across Tacoma's ridges and slopes. Streetcars helped that network spread. Their routes extended outward from the central business district, carrying workers, students, shoppers, and visitors toward the North End, South Tacoma, Hilltop, and other growing areas. Residential development followed the rails. Houses appeared along the routes, and then came small businesses, schools, and places of worship. The pattern was gradual, but easy to recognize. As the streetcar lines reached farther across the city, neighborhoods grew beside them. At a streetcar stop, the ordinary life of Tacoma came briefly together. A teacher might wait beside a waterfront worker returning home. A shopkeeper could carry parcels from downtown, while students held books beneath their coats against the rain. The cars did not remove Tacoma's steep hills, but they made the distances between the waterfront, downtown, parks, schools, and residential districts easier to cross. Education became one of the city's strongest civic ambitions. Public schools were practical necessities in a place with many young families, yet they were also signs of permanence. A school building suggested that a neighborhood expected to remain. It created a shared calendar of morning arrivals, afternoon departures, lessons, examinations, concerts, and public meetings. Tacoma's public library history began in the 1880s. Early collections offered books and reading rooms at a time when many households could not easily obtain a large collection of their own. In the early 20th century, a Carnegie-funded library building opened in Tacoma. Like other Carnegie libraries of the period, it reflected a civic belief in education and in the value of public access to books. Within the library, the pace of the city grew quieter. Readers turned pages at tables. Newspapers connected Tacoma with events beyond the region. Reference works offered information about geography, science, law, and industry. Fiction carried readers into imagined lives in distant places. The library's purpose was personal, but also civic. Knowledge, its supporters believed, should have a public home. One of Tacoma's grandest school buildings began with a very different purpose. In 1891, during a period of confidence and civic promotion, the Northern Pacific and the Tacoma Land Company began constructing a large hotel on a bluff overlooking Commencement Bay. The building was intended to receive travelers in an impressive setting, with broad views across the water. Its scale expressed the expectations of the railway era, when Tacoma's promoters imagined a great future for the city. Then came the Panic of 1893, a severe national economic downturn. Investment slowed, businesses struggled, and construction on the hotel stopped. For years, the unfinished structure remained above the bay, its original purpose unrealized. Tacoma eventually gave the building another use. The school district acquired the unfinished hotel, and architect Frederick Heath guided its adaptation as a high school. This required more than placing desks inside vacant rooms. The structure had to be reshaped for classrooms, corridors, offices, and common spaces. Gradually, a symbol of an interrupted boom became a public institution devoted to education. Tacoma High School opened in the building in 1906, with 878 students and 38 teachers. Each school day, students climbed the slope toward a structure unlike most schools of the time. From its high position, they could look toward the bay and the city below. In 1913, Tacoma High School was renamed Stadium High School. Its history offered a quiet lesson in adaptation. A grand private venture left incomplete after an economic crisis had been given a lasting civic purpose. A building once intended for visiting travelers became part of the daily lives of Tacoma students, teachers, and families. From the high ground near the school, railway lines could be seen drawing toward the waterfront. Trains remained central to Tacoma's identity in the early 20th century. They carried passengers and mail, as well as raw materials and manufactured goods. Union Station, completed in 1911, gave that movement a monumental public setting. Its large interior dome rose above a busy waiting room. Light entered from above and settled across benches, luggage, and travelers' coats. Announcements moved through the open space. Families welcomed arriving relatives. Porters guided baggage toward the trains, watching the station clock or listening for news of a departure. Union Station gathered many journeys beneath one roof. Yet much of Tacoma's civic life was being created in smaller neighborhood places, beyond the station and its railway platforms. Immigrant communities established churches, temples, newspapers, businesses, mutual aid groups, and cultural associations. These institutions helped people find work and housing, care for those who were ill, arrange funerals, celebrate important occasions, and preserve languages, beliefs, foods, and artistic traditions. They offered continuity between the places people had left and the city where they were making new homes. From the late 19th century, a Japanese district developed in downtown Tacoma. It was known as Nihonmachi, meaning Japanese town or Japanese neighborhood. At its height, Tacoma's Nihonmachi included hotels, shops, restaurants, newspapers, religious institutions, and a Japanese language school. Nihonmachi was more than a group of businesses. It was a lived community. Travelers could stay in Japanese-owned hotels. Families could purchase familiar foods, read local newspapers, attend religious services, and send children to language lessons. Restaurants, shops, schools, and meeting places created a neighborhood rhythm, while newspapers shared announcements, community concerns, and news from farther away. Other immigrant communities formed their own networks of care and belonging. A religious building might serve not only as a place of worship, but also as a meeting hall, school, and source of assistance. Mutual aid groups helped members through illness, unemployment, or the loss of a family provider. Cultural associations maintained customs and relationships while helping people adjust to life in Tacoma. These communities changed the sounds and textures of the city. Different languages could be heard in homes, stores, schools, and places of worship. Food traditions traveled across oceans and along rail lines. Music, ceremonies, newspapers, and household customs became part of Tacoma's everyday life. The city was not shaped by a single civic vision. It was shaped by many overlapping efforts to create familiarity, dignity, and connection. Still, civic growth did not benefit everyone equally. Public institutions might speak of education, opportunity, and shared life. While existing within a society marked by restrictive laws and racial discrimination, barriers affected property ownership, schooling, housing, and employment. Some residents could choose where to live, work, or open a business with relative freedom. Others faced limits imposed through law, custom, hostility, or exclusion. Even a place described as public could be experienced differently by different people. A library, school, park, or streetcar might belong to the whole city in principle, yet not everyone entered with the same sense of welcome or safety. The beauty of a park and the promise of a school were real, but so were the boundaries that kept civic life from being fully shared. To understand Tacoma in this era is to hold both realities together. Parks, schools, libraries, hospitals, congregations, and neighborhood organizations brought learning, recreation, care, and beauty into many lives. At the same time, the city's civic promises remained incomplete. Communities denied full participation continued to build institutions of their own, creating belonging and mutual support where official systems often failed them. As evening gathered, lights appeared beneath the dome of Union Station. Streetcars followed their routes away from downtown, climbing the hills and carrying passengers toward homes in growing neighborhoods. The trees of Wright Park settled into shadow. Classrooms, libraries, meeting halls, and places of worship grew quiet at the end of the day. Railway lines descended toward the working shoreline. There, people and goods moved between land and water, while the currents of Commencement Bay continued around pilings and piers. Tacoma's civic institutions had helped the city settle into the rhythms of neighborhood life. Soon, attention would turn more deliberately toward the waterfront, and toward questions of who should control the docks and how the harbor might serve the wider community. From the station dome and the branching streetcar lines, the city's movement returned to the bay, where Tacoma would create a public port for a new century of trade. Chapter 8: A Port for a New Century. Morning came gently to Commencement Bay, laying pale light across the water and tracing the shoreline where rivers, tide flats, rail lines, mills, and warehouses met. From Tacoma's hills, the harbor appeared calm, though its edges were already in motion. Locomotives guided freight cars toward the docks, mill crews prepared for work, and gulls drifted above the pilings. For generations, these waterways had been part of the homeland of the Puyallup people. The river and bay supported fishing, gathering, travel, and trade, carrying nourishment and memory. As Tacoma expanded, settlers, railroad companies, and industries reshaped the shoreline. Channels were straightened or deepened, wetlands filled, docks extended into the water, and tracks crossed ground once patterned by tides and river channels. By the early 20th century, Tacoma's waterfront had become a complicated meeting place. Private companies controlled important sections of the harbor, and the Northern Pacific Railway held considerable influence over transportation and access. Many residents believed the waterfront should serve more than a few private interests. They wanted public wharves, improved shipping facilities, and rail connections available to more businesses and communities. In 1911, Washington authorized publicly owned port districts. These districts could purchase land, improve waterways, construct terminals, and manage harbor facilities for public use. Citizens could establish a port by vote, allowing the district to make long-term investments that individual companies might not undertake. Tacoma supporters proposed such a district for Pierce County, but the measure narrowly failed in 1912. Some opposition came from rural areas. Residents far from Commencement Bay wondered why their taxes should support Tacoma's waterfront. Farmers in smaller communities were not always convinced that public docks would benefit them. Port advocates continued their campaign. They argued that a public harbor could connect the county with wider markets. Farm products, lumber, and manufactured goods could move through Tacoma, while supplies arriving by sea could travel inland by rail and road. The port, they said, would join city and countryside, water and land, local work and distant trade. The debate raised broader questions. How much waterfront should remain under private control? Who should pay for improvements and who would benefit? Some advantages might appear quickly, others might take years. For a time, the questions remained unsettled. Then the First World War changed the pace of life along the bay. War began in Europe in 1914, but its economic effects soon reached Puget Sound. Demand rose for lumber, ships, food, and industrial materials. Cargo movement increased sharply. Warehouses filled and emptied. More freight crossed the docks, and employers sought workers to move goods among ships, rail cars, mills, and storage buildings. Shipbuilding also expanded. In 1916, Todd shipyards began developing an operation in Tacoma. The work required broad areas beside deep water, along with rail access, machinery, timber, steel, and skilled hands. Carpenters shaped timbers, metal workers formed and fastened plates, and electricians installed wiring. Painters, machinists, laborers, and clerks helped turn plans and materials into vessels. Wartime contracts brought intense activity. The waterfront sounded with measured hammering, warning whistles, machinery, and footsteps across wooden platforms. Workers arrived in shifts, sometimes before sunrise or returning after dark. Families adjusted meals, errands, and sleep to shipyard schedules. Throughout Tacoma, daily life felt the pull of wartime production. The work brought wages, but it was strenuous and dangerous. Shipbuilding required coordination around heavy materials, elevated platforms, noisy tools, and crowded spaces. Labor organizations sought fair pay, reasonable hours, and safer conditions. Workers, employers, and government agencies did not always agree. Harbor growth depended not only on investment and engineering, but on those who built ships, handled cargo, maintained tracks, and kept the waterfront operating. As the war neared its end, the shipyard's future grew uncertain. Federal orders had encouraged rapid construction, but peacetime needs differed. Some government ships were canceled, while others were completed after the war. The transition showed how closely Tacoma employment could depend on decisions made far beyond the city. Pierce County now considered the public port again. On November 5, 1918, voters approved the publicly owned Port of Tacoma by a wide margin. The decision came only days before the armistice ended fighting in Europe. As wartime activity began to ease, the port district offered a way to guide the waterfront through an uncertain period. The Port of Tacoma began with approximately 240 acres, much of it around tide flats already altered by dredging, filling, mills, rail construction, and industry. Officials planned terminals where ships could load and unload efficiently. They also developed waterways, warehouses, railroad connections, and industrial land. Every part of the harbor depended on the others. Vessels needed water deep enough to reach their berths. Cargo required workers, equipment, storage sheds, and clear terminal routes. Rail cars had to approach the docks, while warehouses needed room for goods awaiting the next journey. Public ownership allowed the district to coordinate these elements and prepare for future commerce. This work continued the transformation of a living estuary where river water mingled with the tides. Mudflats and shallow channels were not empty, even when promoters described them that way. They supported plants, fish, birds, and the enduring cultural life of the Puyallup people. Development created jobs and strengthened trade while narrowing natural habitats. Both realities became part of Tacoma's relationship with the bay. After several years of preparation, a commercial vessel approached the public facilities. On March 25, 1921, the Edmore arrived to load lumber for Japan. It was the first commercial ship to call at the new public port. Stacks of lumber waited along the docks. The timber had passed through many hands, moving from forests to mills and then by rail or other transport to the waterfront. Dock workers guided it aboard and arranged the cargo for its journey across the Pacific. The Edmore carried little compared with the vast quantities the port would handle later. Yet, its arrival held clear meaning. Tacoma now possessed a publicly managed doorway to maritime trade. The ship connected forest workers, mill crews, railroad employees, warehouse workers, dock workers, sailors, merchants, and overseas buyers in one chain of exchange. After loading, the vessel departed Commencement Bay for the wider waters of Puget Sound. Behind it stood facilities ready for other ships and goods. The moment was less a final achievement than the beginning of a routine. Vessels would arrive, cargo would move, and ships would depart, linking Tacoma with places beyond the horizon. During the 1920s, those connections expanded. Steamship lines linked Tacoma with ports in Asia, Europe, South America, Alaska, and elsewhere. Lumber moved outward in great quantities, while manufactured goods arrived from distant factories. A crate might cross the Pacific, rest in a Tacoma warehouse, and continue inland by rail. Timber traveled the other way, from forest to mill, freight car, and ship. By the decade's end, the public port had become a meeting point for these journeys. Steamship schedules connected the waterfront with distant markets. Rail lines carried goods between the bay and inland communities. Warehouses held cargo between stages, while repair shops and industrial sites supported the machinery of trade. These developments drew rural Pierce County closer to the waterfront, fulfilling part of the argument supporters had made after 1912. Agricultural products and supplies could pass through the harbor, while maritime commerce supported rail service, storage, repairs, and businesses beyond the docks. Benefits were neither direct nor evenly distributed, but the port's connections reached far inland. Prosperity was not shared equally. Employment rose and fell with shipping schedules, contracts, and distant markets. Waterfront jobs remained demanding, and workers continued organizing around wages, hours, safety, and security. The port belonged in law to Pierce County's people, but the meaning of public benefits still had to be negotiated. Questions also remained about the land and water beneath the facilities. Every dredged channel and filled tide flat made industry easier, while further altering the estuary. Commerce, labor, public authority, Puyallup rights, and shoreline life remained intertwined. Creating the district did not settle those questions, it provided a new institution through which they would continue to be considered. Commencement Bay kept its tidal rhythm. Water rose around the pilings and slowly withdrew. Ships bearing distant names arrived, rested beside the docks, and departed toward the Pacific. Warehouses and rail yards spread across the flats, while homes, schools, and civic buildings remained visible on Tacoma's hills. The port widened Tacoma's connections to the world, deepened its dependence on distant markets, and continued the shoreline's transformation. At evening, lamps appeared beside tracks and warehouse doors. A locomotive moved slowly, chains settled against a deck, and a whistle ended a shift. Before long, economic hardship would slow trade and test local families. Then over the Narrows, a remarkable bridge would rise, sway, and enter Tacoma's continuing story of work, engineering, and endurance.